The title of this video on global climate change is Zero Carbon, the Science, and more information can be found on the website onlyzerocarbon.org. Very few people know about it because it's not being communicated. But the most important and the most definite fact of global climate change science is zero carbon. The fact is that only zero carbon can stop global warming, climate change, and ocean acidification from continuing to increase. And the fact is that global warming, climate change, and ocean acidification will last for over 1,000 years. The place in the IPCC assessment, the last assessment in 2007, where you can find the most clear and definite expression of the zero carbon sciences in the IPCC frequently asked questions section, and specifically 10.3. The question is related to if emissions of greenhouse gases are reduced, how quickly do their concentrations in the atmosphere decrease? And the part of the answer relating to carbon dioxide is as follows. Because of the slow removal process, atmospheric CO2 will continue to increase in the long term, even if its emission is substantially reduced from its present levels. In fact, only in the case of essentially complete elimination of emissions can the atmospheric concentration of CO2 ultimately be stabilized at a constant level. So that really couldn't be more definite or clearer. In order to completely stop atmospheric carbon dioxide increasing for good, then we have to stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. This is a graph from the IPCC assessment, and it demonstrates the scientific basis of why only zero carbon dioxide emissions can stabilize atmospheric carbon dioxide, and hence why only zero carbon can stop global warming and climate change, and also ocean acidification continuing to increase. The title of the graph is Decay of Pulse CO2 Emissions. This is a computer model experiment. The computer model simulates what happens when a single instantaneous pulse of carbon dioxide is injected up into the atmosphere, and then the model follows the concentration of carbon dioxide after the pulse has been injected. This is 100% then, starting at 0% here, and it's followed over a time frame shown in the graph here as 100 years. So the computer model follows the change in the concentration, the declining concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide as the natural processes of the planet remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The result is that at 100 years, 33% of the original carbon dioxide pulse remains in the atmosphere. Continuing the computer model experiment longer, it's found that even at 1,000 years, 19% of the original pulse of carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere. So the lesson is that 20% practically of all carbon dioxide emissions will remain in the atmosphere 1,000 years after the emission of the carbon dioxide. Here is a little animation to show what the computer model does. The atmospheric concentration dropped fairly briskly for the first 10 years. But after the first 10 years, the ability of the planet to remove the atmospheric carbon dioxide slows down. It gets less and less and less and less over time. So that at 100 years, there is still 33% of the original pulse of carbon dioxide remaining in the atmosphere. If the model is run for 1,000 years, at the end of 1,000 years, there's still 19% of the original carbon dioxide still left in the atmosphere. Also important to understand is that the main reason for the initial fairly brisk reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide, of course, is that it's taken up by the ocean. And that's not a good thing because that acidifies the ocean. This is a more detailed and longer time frame illustration of what we've just been looking at, the results of computer carbon cycle modeling. This is a more recent, more detailed and longer time frame illustration of the same thing that we've just been looking at, carbon cycle modeling to project the rate of removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and hence the residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere after it's been emitted. This is from a 2010 publication by the National Research Council, Climate Stabilization Targets. The graphic is timescales for removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. This is the same instantaneous pulse of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's expressed as atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration here. This is the time frame, which goes up to more than 100,000 years and is divided into blocks. The blocks indicate the various chemical and physical and biological processes whereby the planet's systems remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The first one is 0 to 100 years. This is 100 to 1,000 years. Here's 1,000 to 10,000 years, and then there's more than 100,000 years. The first block up to 100 years is largely the ocean absorbing carbon dioxide by dissolution of the carbon dioxide on the surface water, and acidification starts. Also, of course, some uptake from the biosphere as green plants photosynthesize carbon dioxide with sunlight to manufacture energy. From 100 to 1,000 years, and from here on, we will remain in the ocean. Everything's dependent on the ocean. The ocean acidification progresses further because more carbon dioxide is absorbed and goes deeper into the ocean. From 1,000 to 10,000 years, we get into the ocean sediment. What happens here is with the biological and the carbon pump, shell-making and shell-bearing organisms incorporate carbon as calcium carbonate. They die and progress to the ocean sediment, and the carbon is thereby incorporated into the ocean sediment. That sediment over ages of time, in fact 100,000 years and more, is compressed into solid rock, limestone and dolomite. So in actual fact, at 100,000 years, there's still a few percentage of the original carbon dioxide pulse remaining in the atmosphere. We're now looking at an illustration of the actual carbon cycle or carbon cycles that the computer modeling to project the rate of removal or decay of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is based. So there's carbon stores and there's carbon sinks. There's a store of carbon in the atmosphere, of course. There's a land carbon store in all the vegetation, the forests and the soil. There's an ocean carbon store in the aquatic biomass and the vertebrates in the ocean. And there's a land carbon sink, which is fossil carbon. And there's an ocean carbon sink, which is limestone and dolomite rock. There is more than one carbon cycle. There's the land terrestrial carbon cycle, which depends on the growing green plants. But there's an ocean carbon cycle as well, which is every bit as important, which also depends on green plants, in this case the ocean green plants. That's particularly the phytoplankton on the surface of the ocean. Because of the vastness of the ocean, there's a vast amount of phytoplankton, and in fact the phytoplankton take up more carbon dioxide by photosynthesis than anywhere else. We then have two carbon cycles, a carbon cycle on the land and a carbon cycle on the ocean, which we've just talked a little bit about. These are both short-term carbon cycles. They operate over time frames of decades to hundreds of years. These are true cycles. They recycle the carbon. They do not remove the carbon from the carbon cycle in a permanent sense. When the trees and the forests decay and die, they return the carbon to the atmosphere that they've taken up by photosynthesis. And the same applies to an extent to the phytoplankton on the ocean surface. There are also very long-term carbon cycles. They're ultra-long-term carbon cycles. And they are the carbon cycles that sink the carbon. There is a land carbon sink and there's an ocean carbon sink. And of course the land carbon sink, the forests and the trees and the animals die, and the carbon is, over ages of time, is compressed and forms the deposits of fossil carbon deep underground. There's an ultra-long-term ocean carbon sink. Through the mediation of shell-bearing organisms and vertebrates, the carbon sinks to the bottom of the ocean on the seafloor and becomes incorporated in the ocean sediment, and that over ages gets compressed and forms limestone and dolomite rock, which is in fact the ocean carbon sink. So there we have it. A large amount of carbon dioxide emissions remain in the atmosphere for an extremely long time, 1,000 years. And some of the carbon dioxide remains for 100,000 years. Therefore, carbon dioxide emissions are extremely persistent and cumulative in the atmosphere. So long as carbon dioxide is constantly being emitted at all by our energy sources and deforestation and cement making, it is scientifically impossible for the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide to stabilize. It most certainly cannot come down to below 350 parts per million, and now it's at 390. And according to the latest assessment by the IPCC, it will not even stop totally increasing. It will not stabilize.